The Presence in the Wall, Charleston, South Carolina, 08/23/2023, 77 risk. I've always felt a slight unease when entering my room at my dad's house. It's funny how you can live in a place for years, and then suddenly, something changes, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that puts your senses on alert, as if your body knows something your mind can't process. Maybe it was just a feeling, but recently, I began to fear that space, something that had never happened before. The room itself wasn't much different from many others. A large bed pressed against the wall, a wardrobe in the back, and in the corner, a bookshelf that had always been there for as long as I can remember. There was also something peculiar about this room. Behind the bookshelf, there was a small hidden room. My dad always said it was a kind of secret room, something the previous owners used as an office. When I was younger, I found this room fascinating. Now, it gave me chills. That night, the house was silent. My dad and my younger sister, Scarlett, had gone to bed long ago. I was lying in bed, the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, making that constant, monotonous noise that instead of calming me, seemed to irritate my nerves with each rotation. The fan's shadows danced across the walls, creating shapes that my brain refused to interpret as anything but mundane movements of light. But something inside me was on high alert. I turned on the TV to try to distract my mind. It was late, and normally I would have fallen asleep with some silly show in the background, but tonight was different. Something was wrong. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I was trying to convince myself that it was just my mental exhaustion. And then, I heard it. A faint tapping, almost inaudible, as if someone were lightly scratching the wall or maybe gently touching the wood. The sound came from the bookshelf. My first reaction was to ignore it. I was used to hearing strange noises at night like any old house makes. But this time, the tapping continued. I paused the show I was watching and stayed silent, listening carefully. The sound repeated, a bit louder this time, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I rewound the show, thinking the sound might have come from the TV. I waited for the same scene, but nothing. Silence filled the room again. I turned off the TV and the tapping returned, even more insistent. It was no longer just an occasional noise. It was almost like a pattern, one that seemed to beg for attention. I tried to think of all the logical explanations. Could it be the wind? An animal in the wall? My mind desperately tried to find a reason that would calm my racing heart. I remembered that my sister Scarlett sometimes woke up in the middle of the night and came to my room. Maybe it was her trying to play a prank on me. "Scarlett, I know it's you," I said aloud, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The tapping stopped immediately, as if turned off by a switch. For a brief moment, I thought I had solved the mystery. It was just my sister. Of course it was. But then, from the other side of my bedroom door, I heard a voice. "Macy, please, can I sleep with you? I can't sleep." It was Scarlett's voice. But something was wrong. I can't exactly describe what it was, but the voice, although identical to my sister's, seemed hollow, like a poorly made copy. There was a metallic, artificial tone to it, like when you hear a bad recording. My whole body shivered. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that it wasn't my sister. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands trembled as I pulled the covers closer to my face, as if they could protect me from whatever was on the other side of the door. I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, as if something was deliberately walking away. The sound echoed through the hallway, but I didn't have the courage to open the door and check. Everything in me screamed to stay where I was. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force my body to sleep. I don't know how, but I eventually fell asleep, maybe from the sheer emotional exhaustion of trying to understand what had happened. The next night, my dad and Scarlett went to the grocery store, leaving me alone at home. During the day, I tried to rationalize the events of the previous night. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the afternoon turned into night, the tension inside me grew. I called a friend to try to distract myself. I told her what had happened, but I tried to turn it all into a joke, laughing nervously. "Just another weird night at Dad's house," I said, trying to convince myself. When my friend had to hang up, I was left alone in the silence of the house. I decided to go down to the living room, turned on a movie, and sat on the couch with my dog, a big, strong Great Dane, always by my side. I felt a bit safer with him around. After all, a dog that size would scare away anything, right? I was halfway through the movie when I heard knocking on the front door. At first, I thought it was my dad coming back, but that couldn't be. I hadn't heard the car. The knocking continued, soft but insistent. The dog, who normally barked at any small noise, was curled up in the corner of the room, trembling, as if he sensed something I couldn't see. Fear crawled up my spine. I went to the door, hesitant, and looked through the peephole. I saw no one. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard a voice from outside. "Hello? I got locked out of my house. Can you help me?" It was the voice of our neighbor, an elderly woman who lived a few houses down. But something was off. She shouldn't have been there. I knew she was on vacation with her family that week. I gripped the door handle, my heart pounding. But before opening it, something froze me. The voice repeated the request for help, but this time, there was an odd inflection, a clumsy tone, as if the person outside was merely pretending to be the neighbor. I began to back away, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, preparing for the worst. The knocking grew louder, as if whoever was outside was growing impatient. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the knocking stopped. There were no more sounds. The silence was broken only by the heavy breathing of my dog, who still trembled in the corner. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, holding the knife with sweaty hands, waiting for something to come back. But nothing happened. When my dad and Scarlett returned, I acted like nothing had happened. But deep inside, I knew something was profoundly wrong with that house. I could no longer be alone in the room. Every time I lay down, I would hear the sounds of tapping coming from the bookshelf, as if something or someone was trying to call me again. Since then, I haven't heard my sister's voice, or the neighbor's. But I know that thing is still there. Something lurks behind the wall, in the small room that was once just a forgotten space. And as long as I keep ignoring it, maybe it will stay quiet. Maybe. The Voice in the Woods. Piney Grove Forest, Virginia, 10/15/2023, 54 degrees Eames. I've always been a logical person, not easily scared. Since I was young, I spent much of my time in the woods, hunting and exploring. The solitude of nature never bothered me. In fact, it was what I cherished the most. When I'm deep in the forest, far from everything, it's as if the world outside disappears, and it's just me and nature. The tranquility of silence, interrupted only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind, or the occasional scurrying of an animal, always brought me peace. Or at least, it used to. That night in Piney Grove changed that. It was the first weekend of deer season, and I was excited to try a new spot I had found weeks earlier. I had spent days setting up trail cameras and observing the movement of the local wildlife. The area was perfect, dense, with few other hunters around, and full of deer signs. I packed for an overnight stay, planning to hunt in the evening and early the next morning, taking advantage of the hours when the animals would be most active. The day started peacefully. I woke up before dawn, eager to get going. The sky was clear, the air cold but refreshing, the kind of weather that invigorates the body. I drove to the location and parked my truck a few miles from the hunting spot. From there, I hiked in with my rifle and backpack. Piney Grove Forest was a maze of tall, ancient pines, their canopies blocking much of the sunlight and casting deep shadows on the forest floor. This dense environment, full of undergrowth and twisted trees, seemed perfect for hunting. I hiked about 5 miles until I reached my campsite, a small clearing I had marked on the GPS weeks before. I set up the tent, prepared the area, and as night fell, I climbed up to the tree stand I had installed nearby. The spot was ideal, a game trail cut through the clearing with clear signs of recent use. As the night descended, the silence enveloped the forest, the kind of silence that would normally soothe me, but that night felt different. I can't say exactly when I first felt a twinge of unease, but I remember shifting on the platform, trying to get comfortable, feeling a nervousness that was unlike me. The wind blew lightly, rustling the branches above my head, and in the distance, I heard the solitary howl of a wolf. Up until then, everything seemed normal. It was around 9 at night when the sound came. At first, I didn't think much of it, a faint murmur, like the wind or some small animal moving through the brush. It wasn't uncommon to hear distant noises that, with the tree's reverberation, seemed to come from places other than where they actually did. But the sound returned, this time clearer. A voice. "Is someone there?" said a woman's voice, tinged with desperation. I froze. My first reaction was concern. It wasn't uncommon for hikers or campers to get lost in that area, especially those with less experience. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere deep in the forest, maybe 200 meters away, hidden by the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but the distress in the voice bothered me. My immediate instinct was to help. "Hello?" I called back. "Are you all right? Are you lost?" There was a pause. For a moment, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. No leaves rustled, no animal sounds, just the heavy, uncomfortable silence. Then, the answer came, but this time closer. "Can you help me? Please, I'm lost." The voice sounded like a young woman, maybe in her 30s, and even more desperate. It didn't make sense. The proximity of the voice was unsettling because there didn't seem to be any movement with it. No sound of footsteps or someone pushing through the thick brush. More than that, the voice had a strange reverberation, as if echoing from somewhere beyond the trees, yet also very near. I started to climb down from the stand, rifle in hand, but something inside me hesitated. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. Logic told me it was just a lost person, but my instincts, honed by years in nature, screamed for me to stay put. Before I could make a decision, the voice spoke again, this time so close it felt like it was just a few meters away. "Chris, please, help me." My blood froze, not because of the words, but because of the voice. It was my mother. The tone, the timbre, everything was identical to my mom, but that made no sense. My mother was hundreds of miles away, in another state, and besides, she had never set foot in that forest, never even shown interest in my hunting trips. She hated the outdoors. And then, the most disturbing part, she couldn't possibly know where I was. I hadn't told anyone the exact location of my campsite. I stood there, rigid, trying to process what was happening. I looked around, straining my eyes to see beyond the shadows cast by the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the area. Nothing, just the underbrush and trees, seemingly unchanged, but with a growing sense of unease in the air. My mind started racing, searching for explanations. Maybe someone was trying to play a prank on me. But who? I was miles from anyone I knew. "Chris," the voice returned, more insistent, like a macabre whisper that seemed to vibrate in my very mind. "Why don't you come down and join me?" I didn't respond. Something inside me knew I shouldn't. I stood frozen, my body trembling uncontrollably. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But before I could move, a second voice echoed from the darkness. "Son, it's time to come home." The voice was my father's, who had passed away 5 years ago. My heart nearly stopped. The familiarity of those words, the fatherly tone that once warmed my soul, now felt like poison, distorted by fear. It was impossible. I was being manipulated. My hand gripped the rifle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Whatever this thing was, it knew exactly how to get to me. And then I saw it. I don't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if something really stepped out of the shadows, but I saw a pale, distorted figure moving with unnatural speed and fluidity between the trees. Its limbs were long and disjointed, and its skin, if that's what it was, seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. There was no face, just a smooth, featureless surface, but its eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, glowed for a brief second before vanishing again among the trees. My legs finally responded. With my heart in my throat, I started climbing down from the stand as fast as I could. I slipped and nearly fell, but I didn't stop. I ran, ignoring the noise I made as I crashed through the dead branches and dry leaves. I didn't care about the hunt anymore. I just needed to get out. The voices, now distorted and overlapping, echoed around me, each one taking on the tone of someone I loved. My sister, my grandmother, even old friends I hadn't seen in years. "Chris, come with us. We're waiting for you. Why are you running?" Each one seemed to tug at something inside me, as if trying to convince me to stop, to give in, but I knew they weren't real. I knew that whatever was out there, hiding in the shadows, wanted far more than my attention. I don't know how long I ran. The trees blurred past me, and the sound of leaves crunching and branches snapping blended with the sound of my own ragged breathing. At some point I tripped and fell to my knees, the rifle slipping from my hand and hitting the ground with a loud crack. I quickly got up, my body aching, and kept going. But now the sound of footsteps behind me seemed closer. Something was following me. Finally, I saw the gravel road that led back to where I had parked the truck. With the last of my strength, I ran to it, unlocking the door and throwing myself into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me several tries to start the engine. When I finally did, I floored the gas, not looking back. The sounds of the forest faded as I drove away, but for a moment, I swear I saw something in the rearview mirror, something tall, pale, and misshapen, standing at the edge of the road, just watching as I fled. By the time I got home, the sun was rising, and everything felt surreal. I wanted to believe I had imagined it all, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a tense night. But deep down, I knew it had been real. I haven't returned to Piney Grove since. My hunting buddies tried to convince me, saying I might have just heard an animal or another hunter. But I know what I heard. If you're ever in Piney Grove Forest and hear someone calling your name, especially if it's someone who shouldn't be there, run, and don't look back. The Whisper of the Willow, Willow Creek, Michigan, 07-13, 1995, 83 degrees. Growing up in a small town in northern Michigan had its highs and lows. The tranquility was both a blessing and a curse. For a child, it meant exploring the surroundings without fear of major dangers. My friends and I spent our summers running through the fields and forests around Willow Creek, creating imaginary worlds that stretched for miles across ancient trees, creeks, and sunlit clearings. But just as with those childhood fantasies, there was a darker side to the stories we made up, a side that, until then, we didn't believe could be real. The summer of 1995 was particularly hot. The heat seemed to smother even the shade of the trees, but that didn't stop us from continuing our adventures. My best friend Sarah and I were inseparable. She was fearless and always pushed me to explore further, to go beyond the familiar trails, to delve deeper into what we called the unknown territory. We felt like real explorers. On one of those suffocating afternoons, we decided to venture beyond the limits where we usually played. We spent the morning building forts and chasing frogs near the creek, but when the sun reached its peak, the heat became unbearable. "Let's go deeper into the forest," Sarah suggested, with that gleam in her eyes that always appeared when she was about to do something daring. I hesitated. I always hesitated. But as always, I gave in. We walked for hours, or at least it felt like it. The forest grew denser, the trees older and taller, and the sunlight barely pierced through the tangled branches above us. The sound of running water faded, and the bird song that accompanied us along the trail also began to dwindle. The silence that settled was almost palpable, as if we were entering a place that wasn't meant to be disturbed. That's when we found it. The old willow tree appeared in front of us abruptly, as if it had been waiting for us. Its leaves hung down in long green curtains, creating a natural canopy that touched the ground. The branches were twisted in strange ways, forming a kind of cover that separated us from the rest of the forest. "Look at this!" Sarah exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. "It's perfect." There was something mesmerizing about that tree. It was the perfect place for a hideout, and soon we found ourselves stepping through the hanging leaves. Inside, the air was different. Fresher, yes, but also heavier, almost suffocating. The leaves swayed gently, despite the lack of wind, and a deep silence enveloped us. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. We stood in silence for a few moments, admiring what we had just found. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the ground. But then, the silence was broken. "Come play." It was a whisper, soft and almost imperceptible. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I looked at Sarah, expecting her to be confused as well, but to my surprise, she seemed excited. "Did you hear that?" she asked, with a mischievous smile on her face. I nodded, but inside, something felt profoundly wrong. "Who's there?" Sarah called out loudly, laughing as if it were part of some game. I was frozen in place. The whisper seemed to be coming from all around, echoing eerily through the willow's branches. I'm alone. Come, play with me. I wanted to leave. My legs were stiff, my body instinctively wanting to run, but my mind was still trying to process what was happening. Let's get out of here, I said, trying to hide the panic in my voice. Sarah looked at me, her eyes still gleaming with curiosity that didn't match my fear. Are you scared? She teased, stepping forward as if she wanted to challenge the voice. The whisper grew louder. Please, don't go. I'm so lonely. Something about those words pierced deep into my heart. There was a mix of sadness and desperation, but with a wrongness, something inhuman. The whole forest seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Sarah gave in to my growing fear. Okay, she said, throwing her hands up as if surrendering to a silly game. Let's go. As we stepped out from under the willow, the air seemed to clear again, as if a pressure had been released. The birds began to sing once more, and the oppressive summer heat returned. We walked back home in silence, neither of us wanting to admit what had happened. Sarah, always the braver one, quickly dismissed the episode as nothing, something we could laugh about later. But I couldn't shake the voice from my mind. In the weeks that followed, other kids started telling stories. Ginny Parker, who lived 2 streets over, swore she heard someone calling her name while she was picking berries near the edge of the forest. The voice, she said, sounded like her mother's, but when she looked around, no one was there. And the stories didn't stop there. The Thompson twins, famous for their pranks, claimed to have seen a shadowy figure running through the trees while they camped in their backyard. Each story was different, but they all had one thing in common: a voice calling, trying to lure the children into the forest. We called it the Whisper, and it quickly became a sort of local legend. The kind of story we told at sleepovers to scare each other, always pretending not to believe it. But Sarah and I knew there was some truth to it. That voice, I never forgot it. And then came Billy Hutchins's disappearance. It was a Saturday morning, early in October, when the news spread. Billy, a 7-year-old boy who lived on the far side of town, had vanished from his yard the night before. He had been playing in his treehouse while his mother prepared dinner. When she called him to eat, he didn't answer. The treehouse was empty, and Billy was gone. The entire town mobilized to search for him. Helicopters, search dogs, dozens of volunteers combed through every inch of the forest, but no trace of him was found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Rumors started circulating, and the stories about the Whisper became more terrifying. Some said Billy had been taken by something that lived deep in the forest, an entity that fed on unsuspecting children. That night, I was at Sarah's house. The two of us stayed up late, watching movies and trying to avoid talking about Billy. But deep down, we knew he had been taken by whatever we heard under the willow. At midnight, we heard it. Outside the living room window, a soft voice called our names. It was Billy. I'm here, come play with me. The terror that gripped me was so intense that I couldn't move. Sarah turned as pale as a ghost. The voice was exactly like Billy's, but something was wrong. Just like the day we heard the whisper beneath the willow, the voice had a distorted tone, as if it were being filtered through something inhuman. We hid under the blankets, trembling with fear, while the voice continued calling us from outside. We stayed like that until dawn, too afraid to move or look out the window. The next morning, Sarah and I made a silent pact to never tell anyone what we heard that night. After all, who would believe 2 10-year-old girls? After Billy disappeared, the forest at Willow Creek fell silent. There were no more voices, and the stories about the whisper gradually faded away. The town tried to move on, but I knew it wasn't over. It never had been. I spent the following years avoiding the forest, but the sound of that voice never left my mind. Even now, decades later, I can still hear Billy calling me back to the willow. Sometimes at night when I'm alone, I get the feeling that if I listen closely, I might hear that whisper again. Come, play with me. The Desert Entity. Farm in Arizona, 08/14/2023, 65 Dikshu. Life on the farm had always been lonely, but I'd never felt it as intensely as I had over the past few weeks. Our farm was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by acres upon acres of desert. When we moved to Arizona 6 years ago, My husband and I were ready to embrace the quiet life in the countryside. The vastness of the desert had its own kind of beauty. Clear skies, absolute silence only interrupted by the wind or the distant howls of coyotes. It was a place where our children could grow up freely, far from the noise and chaos of the city. But lately, something had changed. It started with small things that could easily be explained if I hadn't been paying so much attention. First, the doors of our house began to be unlocked at night, even though I was absolutely sure I had locked them. On one occasion, I found the garage door wide open at dawn, even though no one had gone out during the night. My husband John always brushed it off, saying it was the wind or one of our kids, Noah or Ella, maybe getting up in the middle of the night. But something in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't that simple. Then there were the noises, sounds that at first I attributed to normal desert life: wood creaking, old windows groaning, crickets chirping, and occasionally the howl of a coyote. But over time, the sounds began to change. What once was the familiar cry of an injured animal now sounded wrong. It sounded human, almost like the desperate scream of someone calling for help, but with a distorted quality, as if it were a poor imitation of a human voice. It was a sound that made my skin crawl. Then, on the night of August 14th, everything changed. A meteor shower was forecast, and I had always loved stargazing at night, especially in the desert. The darkness was absolute, with nothing to obstruct the view of the stars. I decided to step outside to watch the spectacle alone, while John and the kids were already asleep. It was a quiet night, the air cool, and the silence complete. I stood on the dirt road in front of our house, staring at the vast and infinite sky, when I heard the first crack. It sounded like a branch snapping or something moving over dry twigs and stones, but there shouldn't have been branches out there, not in the desert. My body stiffened, my senses suddenly on high alert. The sound came from somewhere ahead of me, maybe about 100 meters away, near the edge of the vast expanse of land surrounding our house. The desert was an inhospitable landscape, covered in sand, dry shrubs, and the occasional lone cactus. At first, I thought it could have been an animal, a coyote or maybe a wild boar, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, the sound changed. What had once been the simple crackle of footsteps became a more deliberate movement, like something walking toward me. The sound of sand crunching under feet or paws was distinct, and the most unsettling part of all was the fact that it was methodical, almost human. I tried to calm myself. It's just an animal, I thought. Nothing to worry about. I was alone in the desert, but I had faced solitude many times before. That was part of life here. But on this night, the air felt heavy, laden with something more than just silence. The crackling footsteps stopped for a moment, and the desert returned to its quiet state, save for the soft sound of the wind brushing against the cacti. I took a deep breath, relaxing my shoulders. Maybe I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But before I could convince myself that everything was fine, I heard a new sound, a voice. "Hello, Noah." My feet froze to the ground. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough for me to hear. It was my son's name. My heart immediately began to race, and my first thought was that Noah had followed me outside. But when I turned to look at the house, all the lights remained off. No one had come out. The voice returned, but this time closer. "Noah, come here." Every hair on my body stood on end. Something was terribly wrong with that voice. It sounded like a child's voice, but it wasn't exactly human. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to mimic the sound of a child, but couldn't get all the details right. The tone was almost mechanical, like a recording being played over and over, but with subtle glitches that made it unnerving. I didn't think twice. I ran back to the house, my feet pounding on the dirt road, heart racing, and hands sweaty. When I reached the front door, I felt as though something was watching me closely, hidden in the darkness. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands trembling so much that I could barely turn the key. Inside the house, everything was as I had left it, quiet, safe. Noah and Ella were sleeping soundly in their rooms, completely unaware of the terror I had just felt outside. For a moment, I stood in the living room listening to nothing but my own heart pounding in my ears, trying to convince myself it had all been an illusion, that I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But it wasn't an illusion. Later that same night, around 3 in the morning, I woke to a noise. A faint rustling, like something scratching at the back door. I lay there, my heart racing, trying to figure out if I was dreaming or if it was real. When the sound repeated, louder this time, I knew it wasn't a dream. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make any noise. I grabbed the flashlight we kept in the kitchen and approached the back door. The soft moonlight illuminated part of the yard, and I could see our dog, Max, lying in the corner, trembling. Something had scared him, and he, a large, strong dog, was curled up like a helpless puppy. As I got closer to the door, the rustling stopped. My whole body was on high alert, fear pulsing through my veins. I placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. I didn't know what I expected to find out there. Maybe it was just the wind rattling a branch or a lost animal seeking shelter. But then, I heard it again. Noah. The same voice. The same cold, distant tone. I swallowed hard. It wasn't possible. Whatever was out there knew my son's name. It knew we were here. I knew I couldn't let this pass. I took a deep breath and slowly unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. The flashlight in my hand trembled, but I managed to focus its beam into the yard. At first, I saw nothing but sand and the shrubs surrounding us. Everything seemed calm, but as I swept the light farther, I noticed something moving in the shadows. It was a low figure, crouched on the ground, its movements erratic, as if it were observing something very closely. At first I thought it was a coyote or some other animal. But then, the thing stood up. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The figure was humanoid, but something was terribly wrong. Its arms and legs were too long and thin, as if its bones had been stretched past their breaking point. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes. There were no eyes, just empty sockets that reflected a faint glimmer from my flashlight. It, or whatever it was, faced me, though I knew it couldn't see. And then I heard the voice again. But this time, it came directly from the creature's mouth. Noah, it repeated, as if desperately trying to call my son outside. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away, slamming the door so hard it nearly rattled. I locked it with trembling hands and rushed to Noah's room, checking to see if he was still there. He was, sleeping peacefully, his innocent face serene, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding outside. That night, I didn't sleep again. I sat in the living room, keeping watch, waiting for the thing to return, but strangely, I heard nothing more. The desert returned to its eerie silence, and only the occasional breeze stirred the bushes outside. The next morning, I told John what had happened, but he brushed it off as a mix of exhaustion and paranoia. I wanted to believe he was right, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But what I saw, that thing, was not a figment of my imagination. The days that followed were worse. I heard the voice more often, always at night, always calling Noah's name. The noises in the house grew louder. Doors that shouldn't have opened were wide open by morning. Max, our dog, refused to go outside at night. Something was out there, waiting, and it knew exactly where we were. Now every night when the stars appear in the clear desert sky, I prepare myself. I know it's only waiting for the right moment, and I fear the day when that thing won't just call for my son, but will take him to wherever it comes from. The voice in the parking lot, Columbus, Ohio, 10/29/2022, 50 degrees. I've never been the type of person to get caught up in superstitions or believe in the supernatural. I'm a logical, practical person, and like many, my routine is pretty normal and boring. I work in IT for a large company in Columbus, Ohio, and most of my days are spent in front of a computer screen, dealing with what feels like endless problems. The biggest horror in my life up until that night was dealing with system failures or clients who couldn't tell the difference between a modem and a router. But everything changed that night. It was a Thursday, and I was heading home late from work. We had a major system failure, and the day stretched far beyond what I'd expected. By the time I finally left, it was almost midnight. I was exhausted, my eyes burned, and all I could think about was getting home, taking a shower, and collapsing into bed. The apartment complex where I live is simple. Not the best place, but far from the worst. 3 low buildings, each 3 stories tall, surround a central parking lot. All very normal, though the place can seem a bit eerie at night, especially under the dim yellow glow of the streetlights. At that hour, the parking lot was almost full, which wasn't unusual. There was probably some event or gathering, and people from nearby buildings had taken most of the spaces. I resigned myself to parking on the far side of the complex, away from my building. I sighed as I stepped out of the car, grabbing my laptop bag. The streetlights flickered slightly as I walked across the dark asphalt, illuminated only by those faint streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows. The air was cold, the kind of damp chill that makes you hunch your shoulders, dreading the coming winter. A distant car rumbled along the main road, but beyond that, the silence was absolute. It was while walking, lost in my own thoughts, that I heard it for the first time, a soft voice coming from somewhere to my right. It was low and almost whispering, the kind of voice that blends with the wind but once heard is impossible to ignore. "Excuse me, can you help me? I'm lost." I stopped instantly, my feet frozen in place. The sound had come from the shadows between 2 parked cars just ahead. I squinted, trying to see through the dimness, but all I could make out was the vague shape of something, or someone, crouched there. For a brief moment, my rational mind took over. It had to be one of the residents, maybe an elderly woman who was disoriented or lost. This wasn't unusual, especially on such a cold, dark night. My heart began to slow down as logic reasserted itself. "Hello?" I called out, taking a step forward. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" There was the sound of movement, a light rustling of fabric or perhaps feet scraping against the ground. A figure emerged from the shadows between the 2 cars. In the dim light, I could make out more details. It looked like an older woman, her gray hair blowing lightly around her face. She was wearing something like a robe or a long nightgown, and she was barefoot, her feet dirty from the grime and debris of the parking lot. "I was taking out the trash," she began, her voice trembling, "and I got lost. Can you show me where Building C is?" For a moment, I just stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. Building C was on the far side of the complex, a few minutes' walk away. It wasn't uncommon for older residents to get confused, especially at night. But something didn't feel right. There was an odd calmness to her voice, as though she was speaking in a very controlled tone, like she was reciting a line that wasn't entirely hers. "Sure," I responded hesitantly. "I can show you. It's on the other side of the complex. Do you want me to walk you there?" The figure remained still, motionless, not moving as I spoke. There was no slightest sign of shivering, no movement at all, not even the expected tremble from someone barefoot in such cold. I started to feel uncomfortable, a heavy sense that something was wrong. Even from a distance, I couldn't make out her face clearly. The shadow of her head, combined with the poor lighting, obscured her features, but the sense of emptiness radiating from her was palpable. "That would be very kind," she said. But her voice changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sounded less human than before. Rougher, as though her vocal cords were being forced to make sounds they weren't supposed to. I couldn't take another step toward her. In fact, without realizing it, I had taken a step back. There was something deeply wrong about this. My instincts, sharpened by a growing sense of danger, screamed at me to get away as fast as possible. Yet my rational mind kept trying to convince me it was just a lost old woman who needed help. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and adrenaline began flooding my system. "I think you should wait here," I stammered, taking another step back. "I can call someone to help you." That's when it happened. The figure, which had been completely still up until then, moved. Not gradually, like a human would, but with a sudden, jerky motion. It straightened up, rising from its hunched position, and its height increased in a way that was almost unnatural. The robe shifted oddly over its body, revealing arms that were far too long, with thin, elongated fingers extending out from the sleeves. My entire body froze with fear as the figure stared at me, though I couldn't see its face clearly. It was as if it was watching me in a way that didn't make sense, as though it knew exactly how I was reacting, even without directly looking at me. Then it spoke again, but this time, It wasn't the same gentle, trembling voice. It was a chorus of voices, all overlapping, as if multiple people were trying to speak at once. And what came out of its mouth was a cacophony of sounds that sent chills down my spine. "Come closer," it whispered, the voices distorting as they spoke. "I just want to see you up close." I've never been able to describe that sound accurately, but it was as if every word had a strange echo, a distortion, as though the voice wasn't coming from this world. And there was no doubt that whatever stood before me was not a person. Suddenly, my body made the decision for me. Without thinking, I spun on my heels and ran as fast as I could toward my building. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and heavy, but I didn't dare look back. Something was chasing me, something that didn't belong to this world. My feet pounded against the asphalt as my heart felt like it was about to burst. The distance to my building seemed to stretch endlessly, as though I'd never reach it. Finally, I reached the entrance of one of the buildings. It wasn't mine, but that didn't matter. I yanked the door open, almost stumbling on the first step. I raced up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. I stopped on the second floor, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. Whatever had been following me hadn't entered the building. At least I hoped it hadn't. I stood there, trying to regain my breath and my sanity, when I heard it again. From outside, near the building's entrance, a voice. But it wasn't the old woman's voice. It was mine. "Hello? Is anyone there? I think I'm lost." Those words made my blood run cold. It was my voice. Exactly mine, as though someone was imitating me perfectly. The tone, the inflection, even the slight nasal twang my voice gets when I'm nervous. It was all there, replicated in an unsettling way. I stood frozen, unable to believe what I was hearing. The voice called out a few more times, repeating the same words, almost like a broken record. And then, everything went silent again. I didn't dare look out the window, too afraid of what I might see. I stayed there for hours, trembling, waiting for the sun to rise. When I finally felt it was safe to leave, the sky was beginning to brighten. The shadows had disappeared, and the parking lot looked absurdly normal, as if nothing had happened. I made a mad dash to my apartment, grabbed my things, and went straight to a friend's house. I didn't tell him the details. How could I? He'd never believe me. I moved out of that apartment the next month. I broke the lease and relocated to a place closer to downtown, where there were more people, more lights, fewer shadows. Sometimes when I'm driving home at night, if I see someone walking alone in a parking lot, I feel a stab of irrational panic. I always speed up, never looking back. And some nights, as I try to fall asleep, I hear that voice, my voice, and I pray I never hear it again in a place where I'm not alone. The Skinwalker in Ontario, farm in southern Ontario, 11/10/2023, 43 to go. I've never been one to believe in horror stories or urban legends, the kind you hear from older relatives or friends around a campfire. I grew up in Ontario, Canada, and spent most of my life in rural areas. Camping, hunting, and exploring dense, isolated forests were part of my routine from a young age. If there's one thing I learned living in the countryside, it's that nature is far more dangerous than any story someone might tell. But after what I've experienced in the past few months, I'm no longer so sure. It all began at the end of last November. I was 18, in my first semester of college, and often went home because of my flexible class schedule. My family owns a farm in a rural part of southern Ontario, surrounded by vast fields and dense forests that stretch for miles. It's not uncommon to see coyotes and other wildlife wandering around at night. Most of the time, they left us alone, and we did the same. What caught my attention first were the sounds. During the last few weeks of October, when I would come home late from college, I'd always hear strange noises as I approached the farm, loud snaps like something moving through the brush along the roadside. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just animals. Autumn was ending, and many creatures were preparing for winter, gathering food or finding places to hibernate. But those sounds continued even when I was inside the house. I might have ignored it all if it weren't for the eyes. One night, when I got home around 11 p.m., I stepped out of the car to head inside, like usual. Our garage is set a little apart from the main entrance, so I had to walk a short distance to the front door. It was cold that night, and the only sound I could hear was the wind blowing across the empty fields. As I walked, something made me stop halfway. In the darkness of the field ahead, I saw a pair of eyes watching me. It wasn't unusual to see glowing eyes in the dark. I knew animals' eyes reflect light, especially when illuminated by the house or car lights. But these eyes were strange. They weren't at ground level, like a coyote's. They were higher up, almost at a human height. At first I thought it might be another animal on a slight rise in the terrain, but as I kept watching, I realized the creature wasn't moving. The eyes stayed fixed on me, as if studying my movements. The wind rustled the trees around me, but whatever was watching didn't make a sound. It just stood there, motionless, a few meters from the farm's fence. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to stay calm. It was probably just a curious animal. I continued walking toward the house, trying to ignore the growing unease. When I reached the door, I took one last look back. The eyes were gone. That night, I couldn't sleep well. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched, but something deeper. A sense that whatever it wasn't normal, that it was following me. The real terror began the following week. It was a Friday night around 11, and I was taking the trash out to the road. We had to leave the bags at the end of our long driveway near the main road because the garbage truck came early in the morning. The night was particularly cold, and the silence in the air felt almost supernatural. I grabbed the trash bags, put on my heavy coat, and went out the back door. I walked along the long gravel path that led to the road, my feet crunching on the frozen stones. The sound of my footsteps was the only noise I heard, and the darkness around me was oppressive, with only the porch light illuminating the start of the trail. As I approached the road, however, I heard a sound behind me. I stopped for a second, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was the sound of gravel being crushed underfoot, or underpaw. I turned slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. At first glance, there was nothing. Just the heavy silence of the field and the wind blowing lightly. But then, there they were again, the eyes. This time, they were closer. The creature, whatever it was now less than 20 meters from me, the eyes glowing in the dark as if reflecting the moonlight. But again, something was wrong. The eyes were fixed, as though they were part of a mask, and the form around them was vague, disjointed. My legs began to tremble involuntarily, and I found myself frozen in place, unable to move. Then the scream came. A high-pitched scream, almost human, echoed through the night, making my heart nearly leap out of my chest. The sound didn't seem natural. It was like an animal trying to mimic the sound of a person. It was a cry of anguish, and immediately afterward, it repeated, this time closer. My legs finally responded, and I started running toward the house, my feet slipping on the gravel as I tried to get away from whatever it was. When I reached the door, I burst inside, slamming it shut behind me and locking it quickly. My heart was still racing, my lungs burning from the run. My parents were already asleep, so I didn't wake them. I wasn't even sure if they'd believe me if I told them what I had seen. What? An animal? A creature? That night marked the beginning of a series of events that I can't explain. In the days that followed, the farm became strangely quiet. At night, I no longer heard the screams or the sounds of animals. There were no more distant coyote howls, no birds chirping in the trees around the property. It was as if all the wildlife had simply disappeared. My parents noticed, but only mentioned it in passing, thinking the animals were migrating because of the season. But I knew something else was going on. One night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard a sound that made me sit up immediately. A soft scratching noise coming from outside my window. My eyes widened in the darkness, fear pulsing through me. I got up slowly and approached the window, my hands sweating, heart racing. When I pulled the curtain aside, I saw a silhouette crouched near the side of the house, less than 2 meters from the window. It was a humanoid figure, but it didn't move like a person. Its limbs were long and disjointed, as if its bones were made of rubber. It was crouched on the ground, and its eyes, those eyes, glowed in the darkness. The scratching continued, as if it was trying to get closer. In shock, I backed away from the window quickly and ran to my parents' room. I stood at their door for a moment, unsure of what to say. I couldn't just wake them up and say I saw. What? How could I explain? a creature crouched near the house. They wouldn't believe me. The next morning I told my dad what had happened. He seemed skeptical but promised to check around the house. We didn't find any signs of a break-in, but the heavy silence around the farm still haunted me. I knew that, somehow, something was out there, watching. As time went on, the sightings became more frequent. And it wasn't just me. My friends who lived in the area began talking about strange sounds in the woods near their farms. Crouched figures watching from a distance, screams that sounded human but were distorted. Whatever it was becoming bold, approaching houses, and leaving a trail of fear wherever it went. But the worst happened on a night in March, when I was returning from college with my girlfriend. We were on our way to her father's house, a remote place deep in the forest near Algonquin. The drive was quiet until, on a deserted stretch of road, we saw a dog sitting in the middle of the road. It didn't move, just watched as we approached. I did the instinctive thing. I slowed down and flashed the headlights, hoping the animal would move, but it didn't. Its form was strangely familiar, as if I knew it, but at the same time, something was wrong. My girlfriend suggested it might be a neighbor's dog, one that frequently escaped, but it wasn't behaving like a normal dog. As I got closer, the dog started to move, but not like an animal should. It stood up on its hind legs like a human and disappeared into the forest. Since then, I haven't returned to Algonquin, and I avoid walking near the forests whenever I can. Now, every sound that used to be normal, a branch snapping, a distant howl, makes me wonder if they are still watching us. I try not to think about it too much, but there are nights when the eyes still glow in the field, and I know that whatever it is, it hasn't left.